Welcome to Politics and Prose. Welcome to come as we celebrate Shadi Hamid's new book, Temptations of Power. I'm David Cohen, and in the tradition of this bookstore that Carla, my late wife, and Barbara Mead have started, we continue under the leadership of Brad Graham and Lissa Muscatine to have serious books about serious topics, about subjects that merit discussion and sometimes don't get the kind of thoughtful, deliberative discussion that we have found, that we find when you read Temptations of Power. So I want to welcome Shadi Hamid to Politics and Prose. This is his first book, and this is his inaugural event at an independent bookstore. So this is really a special occasion. And I have to say, when I read this book, as a guy who's read some of the journalist books that dealt with the 30s when we were in turbulent times, Vincent Sheehan, William Shirer, Martha Gellhorn, what we have here is not only the qualities of a journalist, because Shadi Hamid was present at the scene. He was present at the ongoing events. But he also gives us the perspective of a social scientist who has used interview techniques to draw people out. He gives us a historic sensibility and a cultural awareness. And in a competitive world, to get the kind of praise he's gotten from people who have been here as authors like Reza Aslan, Vali Nasser, Noah Feldman, Peter Beinart, and Marie Slaughter, they all were present here. This is really a real tribute. Shadi, I'm sure, will discuss the paradoxes in his book about how moderation is sometimes fostered under repression, how elections can lead to plebiscitary democracy that ends up with authoritarian tendencies, how rapid urbanization, the surge of educational attainment leads to increased political mobilization, and sometimes and that creates a public space for Islamist thought and action. And so these are the kinds of things we're dealing with as things unfold, even today in Iraq and the kind of troubled times that we all know. So let's welcome Shadi Hamid to Politics and Prose and begin our discussion.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, David, for the very kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming. Looking forward to the discussion. It's a pleasure to be at Politics and Prose for the first time speaking. So let me just let me start and just say a little bit about how this book came to be. So it was really almost 10 years in the making. So I was living in Jordan in 2004, 2005. I was there for about a year, and I was conducting research on the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. And, ever since then, I've really been hooked and trying to track the evolution of these groups, which I found in 2004, 2005 to be quite fascinating, and I wanted to learn more. Now, it was a little bit odd at the time. That was before Islamists were really the cool thing to do, before the Arab Spring. And I was actually the only Western researcher living in Amman at the time focusing on this particular issue. And it must have been weird for the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood, because I would go to their headquarters. They had a little archive room, and I would go there sometimes days at a time, hours at a time, and they were very open in terms of letting me be there, but they were also a little bit confused. Who is this American researcher? Why does he care so much about us? We're the Jordanian Brotherhood. We don't get a lot of attention. So I was a young, naive graduate student then, and they probably thought I was harmless. So what I've really tried to do since is immerse myself in the world of political Islam. And I think to do that, you have to do something very simple, although people don't always do it. And that's sit with these guys, get to know them as people, their fears, their aspirations. Islamists might seem foreign to us as Americans, but they are real people. And what I've tried to do living in the Middle East, living in Jordan, Egypt, and in Doha, is spend a lot of time with them and understand what drives them, what animates them ultimately. And we don't have to agree with Islamists, we don't have to like them, but we do have to understand them, especially now, and that's what I try to do. Now, let me just start off with a quote from someone who you all probably know, former Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi. So the first democratically elected president of Egypt, and also he was ousted in a coup last year, actually almost exactly a year. Yes, almost a year from today. So I met with Mohamed Morsi for the first time on May 8th, 2010, and I got to know him a little bit before he became president. And it's kind of funny to look back because I would have never dreamed, and he probably would never have dreamed, that he would become the first democratically elected head of state in Egyptian history. And he wasn't the most impressive guy. He was more of a kind of loyalist and apparatchik. He wasn't really someone who had strategic vision. And that's why I didn't think much of him when I met him. I didn't spend as much time as maybe I would have liked to in retrospect, but I did get to know him a little bit. In that first meeting, I was looking back at old recordings, and he said something very interesting. This was in May. So this was in May 2010, just a few months, 8 months before the Arab Spring started. So I described the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt as an opposition group, but he actually objected to the use of the word opposition. And this is what he told me, quote unquote, "The word opposition has the connotation of seeking power. But at this moment, we are not seeking power because that requires preparation and society is not prepared." Again, just 8 months before the Arab Spring would change everything for the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And this kind of shows you the mindset that they were in. The prospect of power seemed so removed that they couldn't even really think of it as a serious possibility. Similarly, Rashid Ghannouchi, the head of Tunisia's main Islamist party, said something similar years before when he was living in exile in London. He said the most dangerous thing is for Islamists to be loved by the people before they come to power and hated afterwards. Let's fast forward a little bit. I had a very interesting conversation with another Muslim Brotherhood leader. His name is Assam Larian. All these guys are in prison now, but this was in May 2011, so a few months after Mubarak fell. So we were talking about how the Brotherhood was positioning itself, and I was really struck to find this quote. Again, as I was finishing the book, I actually hadn't even realized he had said this, but I found it just a few months before I finished the book. And he actually said, quote unquote, "The people won't accept an Islamist president." And he went on to explain why he thought that was the case. And this was essentially his way of saying, steady as she goes, we're not going to rush to power, we're going to take things a little bit at a time. And this is why I decided to call the book Temptations of Power, because they insisted that they knew the dangers of power. And this was a real theme that I kept on seeing in my conversations before the Arab Spring began, that power, a kind of ambivalence to power. That, again, thinking more about the long game and let's not rush too much. But despite seemingly knowing better, they succumbed to the temptations of power. And I mean, we've all been through that where while you're doing something, you really know it's a bad idea. This is a really bad idea. And you know it while you're doing it, but you still do it for a variety of reasons. And then you regret it afterwards, but by then it's too late. And I think now, at least some in the Brotherhood are entering into this state of regret. Now, the book it covers really up until August 2013. So I kind of cover a period of about 40 years. I picked August 2013 because the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history happened on last August 14th, the Rabaa massacre, where more than 600 people were killed in just mere hours. But what was interesting about that is I felt something I didn't expect. I was meeting with Brotherhood activists and leaders just a couple days before the massacre in Cairo. So it was a very tense time. And I had an interview with Assam Larian, so the same guy I mentioned before, and he came down to meet with me in a T-shirt and sweatpants, and he had a big smile on his face. I've never seen him so calm and comfortable before, and I was confused. There's an impending massacre likely to happen, but why do you seem so chill? Similarly, another Muslim Brotherhood official I met with that day, Jihad al-Haddad, again, he's also in prison right now. He told me that he felt, quote unquote, very much at peace. So that was really interesting. And this was about a month after the coup that ousted Morsi. So you'd think a very difficult time. But there was something about it that they felt like they were back in their original state. There was something more pure about being in opposition. And they'd been in opposition, after all, for more than 80 years. So there was this kind of, this feeling of religious purity, that they were back where they belonged, and God and history were on their side. Now, the massacre then happened, and we are where we are now in Egypt. So this is just all a way to say that in the book, I talk about two distinctive phases: the phase of opposition and then the phase of democratic openings, and trying to understand how Islamist movements respond to these different pressures and incentives. And of course, here I'm talking about mainstream Islamist groups, or quote-unquote moderate Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, that are primarily nonviolent. They believe in political participation through the democratic process. So I'm not talking about the guys in ISIS. And I should have said, this is a very auspicious day to have this event. Some of you may have heard that ISIS declared the reestablishment of the caliphate. So there is now a caliphate in large parts of Iraq and Syria. So it's good that we're having this discussion today. So one of the key arguments I make in the book is that, contrary to the academic and conventional wisdom, repression, rather than having a radicalizing effect on Islamist groups, can actually force them to become more moderate. And this is something that I found in my research over the years. It was a kind of counterintuitive finding, and it's not something I was planning to find in the first place. But essentially what I found is that on key indicators, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jordan had become more moderate, just as their regimes were becoming more repressive. So part of what I try to do in the book is understand why we have this puzzle of moderation, that repression actually forces them to become more moderate, or as I call it, forced moderation. Now, by moderate, I mean a few things here, that the Muslim Brotherhood in these two countries, they embraced many of the tenets of democratic life, including alternation of power and popular sovereignty. They de-emphasized the place of Sharia law in their political program. They reached out to secular groups and parties like never before. And importantly as well, they democratized their internal organizational structures. So that's what I mean by moderation here. But let me just offer a disclaimer, and we talk about this a little bit more in the question and answer session if you're interested. But I'm not saying that repression is good. I'm not saying that repression always has a moderating effect. Sometimes it clearly doesn't. But I'm saying that under certain conditions, repression can have these counterintuitive effects of pushing Islamist groups to become more moderate. Now, the flip side of this is what happens to Islamist groups under democratic openings. And that's more relevant today, because during the Arab Spring, we had various Islamist parties coming to power through the democratic process. Now, Here, the academic wisdom is that as ideological parties participate in the democratic process, they move to the center. And the idea here is they have to reach out to independent voters, they have to build broad-based coalitions, so all that pulls them to the middle. And that sounds intuitive, right? And actually, it's really interesting that this is not only the academic wisdom, but it's also reached the highest levels of policymaking in our own country. And again, I found this quote by accident in retrospect, but another former President George W. Bush, had a very interesting response to a question in 2005 about Hezbollah's participation in Lebanese politics, Hezbollah being the main Shia Islamist party in Lebanon. This is what he said, quote unquote, "I like the idea of people running for office. There's a positive effect. Maybe some will run for office and say, 'Vote for me. I look forward to blowing up America.' But I don't think so. I think people who generally run for office say, 'Vote for me. I'm looking forward to fixing your potholes.'" This is also known as the pothole theory of democracy. And I'm actually not joking. There are academic articles now that actually call it the pothole theory of democracy. So we have George W. Bush to thank for this contribution to academic discourse. So anyway, I argue that the reality was quite a bit different. And what I do in the book is I look at forgotten periods in Egyptian and Jordanian history, in the 1980s in particular, where you have small but significant democratic openings. And we actually see the Muslim Brotherhood responding to these openings by moving further to the right, doubling down on their conservative base. They become more illiberal. And this has to do with their views on Islamic law in a variety of different areas. And I'll just give you one example. That there was, in Jordan, in 1991, for example, there was a brief period where the Brotherhood had 5 ministries in a coalition government. And again, we forget this, but it's one of the first instances of Islamist participation in the executive branch. They also had a plurality in parliament. And during a 6-month period, they proposed legislation, for example, on prohibiting alcohol consumption, restricting the use of interest in banking, and banning co-education on the primary, secondary, and university school levels. In Egypt, in the mid-1980s, we again see this nearly obsessive focus on Sharia law. But it's not just about Islamist parties. What we find is that democratization pulls the entire political spectrum further to the right. So even an ostensibly secular party like the Weft Party in Egypt actually decided to Islamize its political program because what did they see? There was a religious revival that was happening across the region. Egyptians were becoming more pious, and many of them wanted more Islam in their politics, not less. So even if you're a secular party, if you want to win votes, if you want to stay relevant, you have to be responsive to that popular sentiment, right? So we see that during that period as well. This extends to the Arab Spring. So under Morsi, during the Brotherhood's 1 year in power, we again see a shift further to the right on the Constitution draft, the draft of the Constitution 2012, allying with ultra-conservative Salafis. So why might this be the case? Again, why do we have this counterintuitive finding? And let me just briefly say that these are deeply conservative societies. So as I mentioned before, if you're elected, if you want to win, you have to respect that. In other words, if there's a popular demand for something, someone has to supply it. And nearly all the available polling we have suggests that to different degrees, large majorities in a lot of these countries, again, they want to see a prioritization of Islamic law. They see Islamic law as being something positive. So for example, in a 2011 Pew poll, 74% of Egyptians said they believe that Sharia should be the official law of the land. In a 2012 March Pew poll, this one is actually quite interesting. 61% of Egyptians said that they preferred Saudi Arabia's model of religion and government, 61% over Turkey's model, which only got 17%, 61 to 17%. There's a lot of other examples of this. So that's one thing. But also, under democratic openings, Islamist groups have to be more responsive to their conservative base. And I talk in the book about it, what I call the Tea Party effect. So it's not just in the Middle East, but here in this country too, we find the Republican Party, which is supposed to be a center-right party, being dragged further to the right because you have the rise of ultra-conservatives. Similarly, in Egypt and other countries in the region, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood no longer have a monopoly on the Islamist vote. They have to compete with newly established Islamist parties, Salafi parties, that believe in a more textual, literalist interpretation of Islamic law. So the Salafis are dragging the Brotherhood further to the right. So what does this all mean? It means that we can actually have a dynamic where, as you have more democratization in the Arab world, you have less liberalism. Or, to put it differently, more democracy leads to greater illiberalism. And that's where the subtitle of the book comes from, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East. Now, this raises the thorny question of, you know, do Egyptians, Tunisians, Jordanians have the right to decide through the democratic process that they would rather not be liberal? Just ponder that for a second. Or to put it a little bit differently, do Arabs have the right to try out an alternative ideological project outside the confines of liberal democracy? Is that an option, or should that option be closed? Now, you know, as Americans, I think we come at it with a certain bias. First of all, I think there's a tendency to think that in the long run, process will trump ideology. That over time, just things will move along this bold, linear trajectory towards liberal democracy. Francis Fukuyama expressed this view in The End of History, of course. But also, we as Americans, the U.S. Had the foundations of constitutional liberalism first, and then and only then did you have democracy in the sense of universal suffrage and full political rights for all citizens. So we, in our own history, had a particular sequencing. But in the Middle East and other parts of the world, you almost get democratization backwards. You start with democracy, but you don't have the liberalism established. And some of you might recall Fareed Zakaria's book, The Future of Freedom, where he popularized the idea of illiberal democracy. That, I believe, came out in 1997, but it's become more and more of an issue since. Now, as I kind of close up here in the next couple minutes, how does this tension between liberalism and democracy manifest itself? And I just want to get a little bit more practical here. So in the 2012 constitutional debate in Egypt, we see this expressed in a very interesting way. So in the Constituent Assembly, you have ultra-conservative Salafis on the far right, you have liberals on the left, and you have the Muslim Brotherhood somewhere in the middle, right? Now, we have a problem here because you have two sides that have radically different conceptions of the good. So liberals believe by definition, or are supposed to believe by definition, that certain rights and freedoms are non-negotiable. But on the other hand, Salafis believe in almost the reverse of that, that the state has a right to interfere in the private lives of citizens according to a religious ideal. That, for them, is a non-negotiable. So what happens when you have two competing non-negotiables? This is challenging. Now, the Brotherhood tried to square the circle a little bit. They came up with a compromise article, Article 219, which was actually more diluted than what the ultra-conservative Salafis wanted. So essentially, this article clarified the meaning of Sharia, but in a somewhat restrictive way. Anyway, it wasn't good enough for the liberals. Liberals saw this as very threatening, and it contributed to the demise of the Constituent Assembly, and many liberals walked out entirely from the deliberations. So the compromise approach didn't work because the middle wasn't going to satisfy anyone. Now, liberals would say that their solution is the compromise solution. That in a liberal society like the one that we live in here in the U.S., everyone, secular, Salafi, Christian, conservative, can express their religious preferences as they wish, right? But the notion that liberalism is neutral can only be accepted within a liberal framework. In other words, Islamists would argue that they can't fully express their Islamism within a secular liberal framework. So it depends how you look at it. Now, so where does this all take us? So we have this fundamental impasse. Tunisia might be a relative bright spot, and I'll just say a couple words about Tunisia, then conclude. It's actually the only bright spot in the region right now. If you look around, I'm kind of depressed now. I mean, you wake up every day and it keeps on getting worse. The prospect of civil war in Libya, which people aren't even paying attention to, Syria, Iraq, the list goes on. Egypt's more oppressive than ever. Tunisia. Okay. So here we had one of the more mild, moderate Islamist groups that was part of a governing coalition. And they're pretty much the fluffiest Islamists you can find. So they were really trying to make a lot of compromises. They went so far as to withdraw the word Sharia from the Constitution. This is a pretty big deal to have an Islamist party say, well, we don't even have to have that word in the Constitution. But what's troubling to me about the Tunisian case, despite that positive aspect, is Islamists were making compromise after compromise on core issues, but you still had a large segment of the secular opposition that said that's not good enough and tried to bring down the democratically elected government through mass protests. They were calling for the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly. They were calling for an Egypt-style scenario. So there was almost a breakdown of political order last summer. They got away from the brink, and Tunisian Islamists had to step down from power voluntarily. But this is concerning to me because Tunisia is not yet an example of Islamism and democracy being reconciled because Islamists had to step down, which raises the question, what if Ennahda keeps on winning elections starting this fall and keeps on doing well, and they feel they have to be more responsive to their conservative base? Is the secular opposition going to accept that or not? So you have a couple options, and I'll just offer this to you as a conclusion here, is if liberals, that can be us as Americans or people in the region, see liberalism as an absolute good and there can be no compromise on liberal values, then they might say, well, repressing Islamists is probably, it's not great, but, it's better than the alternative. And this is what's happening right now in Egypt, where the Brotherhood is being brutally suppressed. Now, I'm against repression, but even putting that aside for a second, there's been this illusion for a long time that Islamists can be destroyed or eradicated. But if they reflect something deeply held in their societies, then it's probably not going to be sustainable. They're part of their societies. The other option is that we find a way to incorporate Islamists in the democratic process. But so far, that hasn't worked out so well. But what this means is that we have to accept that democracy will be at least somewhat illiberal. Somewhat illiberal, because Islamists will play a major role. Sometimes they'll win elections, but they'll definitely do well at least, and that will have an effect of pushing the spectrum in a more conservative direction. Are we willing to accept that? I would argue it's the only option if we really want to have some semblance of democracy in the region. And I would also argue that Islamists, by definition, are at least somewhat illiberal. And we have to, what I really tried to do in this book was take seriously the role of ideas and ideology. And again, as Americans, we want to believe that everyone moves to the center. Everyone goes through some secularization process and ends up somewhere. But having spent the last 10 years, spending a lot of time with Islamist activists and leaders, one thing that I've really come out of it with, these are ideas that are deeply and honestly felt. They believe something. They have a distinctive worldview. They have a distinctive vision for society. And that's what makes this divide in the region so existential. We're talking about very basic things, about the meaning and purpose of the nation state, the role of religion in public life. This is not about differing policies. This is not just about power and politics. It's about something deeper. And I think this deeper fundamental divide will shape the Middle East for years and decades to come, for better or worse, but probably for worse, at least in the short term. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Shadi, for this just a fantastically stimulating talk. And all I kept thinking was, we need Yeats here to remind us of the importance of the stakeholders so that the center can hold. That great quote, which I can only remember about the center not holding, but that's what we need. And that when you're talking about liberal democracy or illiberal democracy, we're not really talking about American liberalism as we know it. We're talking about really almost the way you define the moderates, what was a moderate approach, which would be pluralistic, not sole domination of Sharia law, various forms of public space that would not be drowned out by mass protests or political mobilization. So why don't we open it up to questions? We have 2 microphones here. This is a public meeting, so if you're comfortable, please tell us your name and just line up at the microphones, and Shadi will rotate the microphones. Carol, you're first.
I'm Carolyn Poplin. I'm a physician. And my question is, with regard to Egypt, what would you have America do? Morsi wasn't pushed out by us. We tried to defend him, even though he ran a very repressive regime. It was the Egyptians who pushed him out. And now we're in the awkward position of seeming to support another repressive authoritarian regime that looks not unlike Mubarak's regime. So the only thing that the Muslim Brotherhood and the Egyptians agree on is that whatever America is doing, it's the wrong thing. They all unite about us. So the question is, what do we've tried to support? We tried to support a democratically elected leader, but to suggest that he be a little less repressive and a little more open. Now we've got Sisi, and he's locked up everybody in the. Well, you see what's going on in the justice system. What should we do?
Sure. So, Egypt is so you're right to point out that the only thing the regime and the opposition can agree on is their dislike for the U.S. It's the only thing unifying them at this point.
Right.
And, we've managed to alienate both sides of the spectrum almost equally. Now, when it comes to Mohamed Morsi, yes, there were some authoritarian tendencies, but I think we also have to be realistic about what to expect right after a democratic transition or right after an uprising. To expect that Egypt would become a liberal democracy overnight is simply not realistic. It's not in keeping with the history of transitions. If you look at Latin America, Eastern Europe, even the places where we had colored revolutions, parts of African Asia, there is a period where it's really a struggle, a push and pull, and you do have sometimes democratically elected leaders who use their mandate, who use their majority to suppress dissent or to try to suppress dissent. But I don't think there's any moral equivalency between Morsi and the Brotherhood and what we see now with Sisi and the military regime. Just in terms of the sheer scale of repression, I think it doesn't even quite compare to Mubarak. It's worse than even Mubarak, which is remarkable. We're talking about, in just a span of about 11 months since the coup, more than 20,000 people have been arrested. More than 2,500 people have been killed. We've had God knows how many mass death sentences, and Egypt keeps on outdoing itself with very large mass death sentences. So 500 people plus condemned to death. Even if they don't actually execute that verdict, which they probably won't, it's still pretty striking. So, what we could have done, or maybe what we should have done, I think right after the coup happened, the U.S. should have put serious pressure on the military, and our law said very clearly, and we didn't even follow our law in this case, that when there's a military coup against a democratically elected government, we have to suspend military assistance. But we didn't even want to call it a coup. And I mean, it's been very troubling to see Secretary of State John Kerry in Egypt just last week praising Sisi, which is remarkable. Look, it's one thing, and we have to be realistic. The U.S. is going to work with autocratic regimes. We're not a human rights organization. That's true. Fine. But that doesn't mean that we have to confer legitimacy. It doesn't mean we have to go out of our way to offer praise. So let's work with the Egyptian government on mutual interests, on counterterrorism, whatever we have to do as a vital national security interest, but let's put serious limits on that engagement, and let's be very clear that we're not willing to accept what the Sisi government is doing. And that's where I think we could have done much more to use our assistance package, to use our military aid as leverage to try to push Sisi in a more positive direction.
But what about the fact that this was a popularly supported coup?
Right.
We didn't. This wasn't
Right,
Chile.
sure.
We didn't do this.
Sure.
They
Well,
did.
Actually, historically, most coups have popular support. That's precisely why they succeed. And that's often what triggers the military to step in when they see people on the street. Because obviously you don't want to stage a coup if no one's going to support you, right? So there were millions of people in the street, but we can't say what the majority of Egyptians wanted or didn't want. That was a big number, but it was still ultimately a minority of the population. That's why we have elections, because you can't just say that whenever 1 million people protest on the street that the president has to step down, right? And that's why I think that as imperfect as it is, and democracy may empower groups that we don't like, the democratic process has to continue. And it's going to be messy, and Morsi was probably going to do more things that we didn't like. And we would have seen more illiberalism in the social sphere in terms of the role of religion in public life. But as long as there was a democratic process, and as long as the rights of the opposition were respected in the sense of being able to organize political parties, being able to contest elections, being able to try to beat Morsi out through the ballot box, that was Egypt's hope. And now we've lost that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ahmed Mir. You know, something you brought out that is more central than just the issue of the Islamists or Egypt is that democracy in the former colonial societies is interesting. What it is doing is bringing more conservatism to the fore. I mean, just following the Indian elections, we see more and more that the leaders are trying to satisfy the lowest level of the public, just like the Tea Party is doing to some extent here. But across the developing world, this is a very central thing that I think you brought out with regard to these Arab countries, but it's actually happening everywhere. And our sense and our dialogue, where we keep talking about democracy, we don't seem to appreciate what democracy means when you have elections and when the politicians have to depend on the voters. For example, as an example in India, the untouchables and the lower castes have not only become the big voters and influencing the politicians, but the dress of the politicians has changed to look more and more like the working class. Just wanted to mention this as a very interesting and important phenomenon.
Sure. Thank you for that's a very important point. And that's precisely part of what I wanted to do with this book was problematize this assumption that good things go together, that democracy means liberalism or liberalism means democracy. Good things don't always go together. Sometimes there's a trade-off. And it's not just in the Middle East. I think India is fascinating because you have a majority of Indians voting for Modi, who has some would say a tragic history. Not only is he a far-right Hindu nationalist, but there are accusations that he has been complicit in genocidal acts against the Muslim minority. But he was democratically elected. And I was actually talking to an Indian Muslim friend of mine the other day, and she made a very important point. Modi is the worst thing on earth to us. This is totally frightening. But he was elected, and we're going to respect that outcome. That's very important, and there's something inspiring that Indians were able to say, well, fine, a lot of us don't like Modi, but the Indian people have spoken, and we have to work with that and hope that he doesn't do something really, really bad. Now, not just in India, but more recently throughout Europe, we've seen the rise of far-right parties that are explicitly and sometimes aggressively anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim. And this is a very troubling trend. And they're dragging the center-right parties further in that direction, where you have a mainstream party like the CDU in Germany, which says things that, quite frankly, I'm surprised to hear about the role of Muslims in society and so on. The Swiss banned minarets through a popular democratic process. The French voted to ban face veils, even though that is a reflection of personal freedom. That too is illiberal, because you're restricting what people can or cannot wear. So we see a lot of examples of this here in the U.S. We still have problems with with these tensions too, where when it comes to restricting abortion rights, discrimination against the gay community, whatever it happens to be, we struggle with this, but we all agree to work it out within the democratic process. I was living in Doha for 4 years. I just moved back in January to here in D.C., and everyone talks about how disastrous and messed up and broken our system is, and it certainly is. But living abroad for a long time, as bad as our system is, there's something beautiful about the American political process. Like, people aren't killing each other in the streets even though they hate each other. That's a very low bar, granted, but when you see it, and I had to see this, unfortunately, before the Rabaa massacre, Egyptian friends of mine, people I care about, people I know, well-educated, telling me, without apology, without shame, that they support the mass slaughter of their fellow countrymen, saying, we want the military to go in and kill them and wipe them out. I had a friend of mine on my Facebook page publicly call for the execution of Muslim Brotherhood members without due process, and he felt a need to emphasize without due process. So execution wasn't enough. So people were saying these things openly and publicly, and that can be very, very scary. And it's the kind of thing that you read about in grad school, about the rise of fascism and neo-fascism in the early 20th century. To see it straight up is a different kind of experience. So it really makes you appreciate that democracy can be very flawed, but it's better than the alternative.
Hello, my name is Sahan. I'm currently interning here this summer in Washington, D.C. in a private equity venture capital fund. I'm originally from the University of Iowa. So my question is, United States has very famously been involved in many countries when it comes to, in the name of either humanitarian interventionism or either when it comes to democratization. The U.S. has been involved. And one thing that trends I've seen is the U.S. tends to pick sides. So either in the color revolutions, 2003, they picked Mikhail Saakashvili just because he was anti-Russian and pro-Western. But at the end of the day, Mikhail Saakashvili was very unpopular at the end of his tenure. Same with Viktor Yushchenko. Viktor Yushchenko was a pro-Western politician in Ukraine, but at the end of the day, he became very unpopular. And same when it comes to Syria. We give weapons to the anti-Assad groups, whether they may be Al-Qaeda, maybe even worse. We still give weapons. I'm just saying, like, the United States involvement, especially when it comes to picking sides, has it really been successful, given the fact that we've seen these results in the Middle East? We've seen these uprisings, whether it's Iraq, whether if it's Syria, whether it's even Eastern Europe. and Eastern Europe, and the response from those countries, the Russia when it comes to Eastern Europe, or like the Iraqi government or the Assad government, or even like the rebels, they have gotten so dangerous in those countries. Should the U.S. like take a break, like take a little break from like picking sides and just look at the whole big picture? Is it time for us now?
Okay.
Sorry, it was
So look, I mean, so picking sides maybe hasn't worked, but splitting the middle hasn't worked well either. I think President Obama has very actively tried to move away from that legacy of interventionism, but I think the record there is mixed, or I would say worse. And obviously Obama doesn't bear anything close to full responsibility, but we are a superpower, so we're part of the problem. And I think that he's presided over the breakup of the Middle East and hasn't had an effective response. And I worry that's going to be part of Obama's legacy when we look back 10 or 15 years from now, that we didn't do the right things in Libya, Syria, Iraq, that we were very reactive, that this has been a putting out fires administration. We wait for the fire to burn, then we go in, and then it's kind of too late. The place is burned down. So that's why I've always felt that a proactive strategic vision was necessary. What do we stand for in the Middle East? What do we want? Like when it comes to Syria, you know, as someone who is very much against the Iraq war, I understand that legacy weighs heavily on our public discourse, as it should. We have to learn from those mistakes, but I worry that we're over-learning those mistakes, that we're still fighting the last war. When we're talking about Syria, we're not really talking about Syria. We're talking about Iraq. It's about us. It's about this struggle that we've had in our country and our public discourse, and we're revisiting those old debates again when it should be, I think, about the Syrian people. They don't figure very prominently into this discussion. And that's why I think that military intervention, not boots on the ground, but limited targeted intervention, airstrikes, safe zones, humanitarian corridors, there should have been a real discussion about that. And we shouldn't have just reflexively said, well, this sounds a little bit like Iraq, so we have to be opposed to it. I think that we have to analyze each case on its own merits, especially when it's rebels, revolutionaries, and protesters on the ground in these countries that are actually formally requesting the U.S. and its allies in the international community to do something. And when people first started calling out for military intervention in Syria, that was in January 2012, and only 5,000 people had died by then. And I remember thinking, 5,000 people, that's a lot. That's a lot. Now it's more than 170,000. Just think about that for a second. And we have to ask ourselves, if we had done certain things differently, by being more involved, by at least more seriously supporting somewhat moderate rebels or less extremist rebels or whatever you want to call them, could the outcome have been different? And I remember that I was speculating on Twitter. I had this back and forth with some friends. We were wondering what would be the trigger for humanitarian intervention in Syria. What would trigger at least airstrikes and maybe the creation of a safe zone? And I remember proposing 15,000 as the trigger. Boy, was I wrong.
I just want...
My name is Ellen Hersher, and this may be beyond the scope of your book, but I wonder if you could comment on Afghanistan. It seems to me that current events there are reflecting the ideas you've presented quite clearly. We have the two candidates in the runoff election, both of whom are very deeply grounded in Western liberal backgrounds, and yet in order to compete in the election, they have moved quite distinctly to the right. And in looking ahead to the next government that will be established in Afghanistan, I'm afraid that most Americans are going to simply look at the fact that women will be more repressed than they have been, or than we wish they would be, and therefore consider it a failure. But I think, you know, to establish a government at all, women will not have Western liberal rights, and and values, and we need to accept that that's the case and not consider it a failure if that happens.
Yeah. So this is a very good point, and Afghanistan is actually another example of this particular dynamic. This is a deeply conservative society in any number of ways. Now, I think so when we as outsiders look at it, we have to be careful because, again, we may see that women don't make as much strides as we might like them to in this new Afghanistan. But it also depends what you're comparing it to. It's certainly not going to be as bad as it was under the Taliban. There still is a significant improvement. Women can go to school when they couldn't under the Taliban. So I think we have to look at liberalism or illiberalism as a continuum. Yes, we have our own liberal ideal, but sometimes that liberal ideal is simply not realistic. So I think there has to be an adjustment of expectations. But there's also another question. Will Afghanistan or other countries ever get to this platonic liberal ideal? Do we think that countries, first of all, have to get there, they should get there, or that they will get there? And, we have to be careful, I think, not to kind of have a reverse essentialism here, that and this is where I haven't liked the kind of discourse, we're all ultimately the same. We all want the same things. And I think there's a tendency to want to believe that, and it's understandable. But what if we're not all the same? What if different electorates, different populations want some different things? Are we willing to respect that? I think it's a very tough question to answer, and there doesn't have to be one answer. But I think we have to respect that there can be cultural specificities. Now, we don't want to take that too far and say that there's a kind of essentialism that, Muslims are always going to be a certain way. So I think there's a middle ground here. And on that note, I think that there's another difficult conversation that maybe we have to have as well. Is there something distinctive about how Islam relates to politics? And again, it's an uncomfortable conversation to have in liberal circles and all that, right? But, I think it is, I would say that if you look historically, if you look at the last 100 years in particular, the Arab world and the Muslim majority states more generally have been quite resistant to secularization. And sometimes it's been attempted very aggressively. In places like Tunisia and Turkey. In Turkey, they changed the whole alphabet. They tried God knows how many things to push Islam out of the public sphere. But it came back. It came back to the point where you have a kind of neo-Islamist party that's currently in power. And again, they were democratically elected, but they're moving further to the right. We've seen that in particular the last few years. And if we look at the broader sweep of Islamic history, there's a lot of variation, but it's hard to find, with the brief exception of a period in the late 19th century and part of the 20th century, there is no real secularism. That Islam and Islamic law have, for the vast majority of these 1400 years, been at the forefront of public discourse. In earlier centuries, you had a kind of secularism in the sense that the caliph was separate from the clerics, but the clerics were still very influential, and Islamic law was still central in legislation. That has been the case. And if we want to go even earlier, Prophet Muhammad, also unlike Christianity where there's at least a tradition of leave unto Caesar what is his, Prophet Muhammad was a theologian, a head of state, a politician, a warrior, all intertwined into one. Does a people or does a religion have to be bound to their founding moment? Of course not. There's nothing constant here, but the founding moment does matter.
So these will be our last three questions. There are people lined up, and we're going to take everybody who's there. So,
has Jordan found the balance that you're talking about, and do they have any chance of standing up against ISIS? Well, I don't hear anything about what response they've had, and which I would think would be a grave threat to that country.
Sure. Yeah, that tells you something that we don't even have the time or the attention to get worried about Jordan. So that's sort of it's very when do you hear Jordan discussed in our public discourse? But Jordan is under threat. I think so far they've proven resilient, despite an incredible number of refugees coming in and altering the very demographic balance of the country. Jordan is already quite divided in other ways. That if you just look at citizens, you have those who are originally Jordanians from the East Bank and those who are originally Palestinian from the West Bank. So it's a very divided society, and there's another concern that King Abdullah is a very close friend of the West, but he has been quite he's not as bad as some others, but he's promised democracy and some degree of liberalization, but we actually see Jordan continuing to be rather autocratic in any number of ways. And I think that part of the argument now that the regime uses is, well, at least implicitly, well, democracy, political openings, they can be kind of messy. And this is why there's been a chilling effect in the region. People look to Syria, they look to Iraq, they look to Egypt, and they say, or Libya for that matter. So this is what happens when you have democratic transitions. We're fine with having a monarchy that's more stable. Maybe we want kind of an iron grip. And what we're seeing now is the rise of the strongman savior throughout the Middle East in Sisi. Sisi came and said, I will give you security and stability instead of the messiness of democracy. That's what General Haftar in Libya is saying now with his sort of attempted coup or something that resembles a coup. And Assad, of course, makes precisely this argument that I offer protection, especially to minorities, to disadvantaged religious sects, and so on. I'm the way to go if you don't want ISIS. So I'm very worried about this new narrative that we see in Jordan and across the region, that a strong man is better than the alternative, and I think it's only going to make things worse.
Hi, thank you for coming to talk to us. Is this on? I just wanted to ask about the title of the book, Temptations of Power, and you said that when you were in Egypt you spoke to Islamists, and many of them said, oh no, we're not looking for power, and then when the critical moment came they made certain decisions. And I know there was a big debate within the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt as to whether or not to participate in popular uprisings, to have a presidential candidate, all of these critical decisions. There was always someone saying just say no instead of kind of giving in to the temptation. So I was wondering how, in your research, what you found out about that dynamic and what those people are doing now, like the Kamal Helbawi and people like that, the people that left the Brotherhood. Are they also in jail or are they forming their own new Muslim Brotherhood?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, that's the problem with the temptations. They're sometimes hard to resist, and this is an example of that. So if you really want to go into the blow-by-blow of how the Brotherhood shifted on the presidential candidate issue, I discussed that in Chapter 6 in particular. There's a lot of factors that go into it. One is that, they saw the political arena wide open, and liberals weren't able to fill the gap. So there was a kind of power vacuum, and they said, well, we have an opportunity to step in. And part of why they were pushed into that is because there was another presidential candidate, a hardline Salafi, Hazem Abu Ismail, who was actually one of the front runners. And this guy was a little bit wacky, but he had a lot of popular support. So the Brotherhood was standing on the sidelines, and they said, well, an Islamist might win anyway. And there was actually 2 additional Islamists who were also running. So he said, well, there might be an Islamist president anyway, so why shouldn't we throw our hats into the ring? And they were particularly worried that if there was an Islamist president who wasn't part of the Brotherhood, that would be a fundamental threat to the Brotherhood's project, because there would be a president with a bully pulpit could create a movement behind himself and really pull Egyptians away from the Brotherhood and push them in a different direction. So there was a real sense of paranoia and threat. Another relevant factor is that Parliament was supposed to be powerful. That was the idea. But then Parliament was dissolved, and this was the first democratically elected Parliament in modern Egyptian history, was dissolved by, what was essentially a combination of military and judiciary fiat. So they asked themselves, well, the whole democratic process is being undermined. People are trying to bring us down just because we did well in the parliamentary elections. And if parliament was going to be non-existent or weak, that meant a lot of power was going to be in the presidency. So they said, well, we can't have parliament at all. So that's another reason to contest the presidency. Now, all of these rationalizations, if you take them individually, seemed rational or reasonable at the time. But the Brotherhood failed to kind of look more strategically. They failed to play the long game effectively, because when you put one on top of the other, they get dragged into this. But they just couldn't stop that slippery slope. But it's also worth noting that the Brotherhood had an internal vote about whether or not to run for the presidency. It was almost half and half, and running for president only won by, I think, 2 or 3 votes. So just imagine the counterfactual. What if the vote had shifted and there was actually a lobbying effort from actually a couple people in particular who actually lobbied member of the Internal Shura Council to vote yes? What if that lobbying effort hadn't happened?
Thank you for your talk. Can you speak about co-opting these Islamist parties, especially in Egypt? Is this something that the regime is looking to going forward, and maybe has this happened in the past, previous regimes?
Sure. So this current regime is trying to co-opt some Salafis. So there's the Noor Party, which is one of the main Salafi parties, again, one of these ultra-conservative parties, and they actually supported the coup against Morsi, and they have been somewhat supportive of Sisi to varying degrees. This has led to a real split in the Salafi camp in Egypt, where many Salafis have defected from the Noor Party and joined the Brotherhood's opposition coalition. Salafis are really interesting because they were very quietist before the Arab Spring began. Then after Mubarak fell, they started forming political parties, which actually went against some of their theology, and they always would argue against multi-partyism, this idea that parties by their very nature are divisive. So you have this tradition in Salafi thought, but they found a way to justify it very quickly, which shows how ideology can be quite malleable if you know where you want to get to in the end. It can be very easily instrumentalized. Now, they've also kind of gone back to a kind of quietism. So in Salafi thought, and this goes back hundreds of years, there's a kind of theological strain about deference to the leader. As long as the ruler is nominally Muslim, they can be bad, they can be repressive, they can be not particularly Islamic, but they're preferable to the alternative, which is chaos. So some Salafis have this very kind of status quo approach to leadership. Now, there's another strain in Salafi thought, which also goes back hundreds of years, which is almost the exact opposite, which is that even if the ruler is a nominal Muslim, if he fails, and it has to be a he, if he fails to implement Sharia law by the letter, then he is no longer a real Muslim and his blood is licit. And this is how many extremist groups justify rebellion against the ruler. That's what ISIS would say, for example, that all these so-called Muslim leaders aren't actually true Muslims. And they would even put the Brotherhood in that camp of not being real Muslims because they don't believe in the true harsh interpretation of Islamic law, which shows you just how extreme some of these groups are. So there's a lot that you can find in the Islamic tradition to justify your positions, but I would say that I think what we're experiencing today in the Middle East is a kind of Salafi moment, or a kind of Salafi jihadi moment, that with the relative decline of the Muslim Brotherhood, with the military coup against Morsi, a lot of young, frustrated Islamists are asking themselves, why should we try to do this through the democratic process? Why should we be so gradualist? The Muslim Brotherhood is talking about decades and a slow process of gradual reform and all of that, where groups like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra say, don't wait. We can have the Islamic State right now, today, through brute force, through violence. And in this sense, I hate to say it, but violence does work sometimes. That's the unfortunate fact of this new Middle East, is that those who want to work through the slow process of democratic messiness aren't doing so good. So that's actually, and you can see that on the headlines every day now, that throughout the region, extremist groups or Salafi groups are gaining ground. And this is why I thought the coup against the Muslim Brotherhood was going to be so dangerous, because it strengthened the extremist narrative better than anything else.